Use questions. Use questions to help your students connect God's world and God's Word. I'm Michael Essenburg of Close the Gap Now, and I want to share with you 5 things you can do to move forward on using questions to help your students connect God's world and God's Word. First, you can analyze why God asks questions. Now, this might seem like an odd place to start, but I suggest this because sometimes we as Christian educators are uncomfortable asking questions when it comes to helping students connect God's world and God's Word. We'd actually rather lecture. And I want to invite you to become more comfortable with asking questions. So think about why God asks questions. God already knows everything. So why, for example, did he ask Adam, "Where are you?" And why does Jesus ask so many questions in the Gospels? I think as you analyze why God asks questions, you become increasingly comfortable with asking questions. Second, you can analyze how questions help. You can analyze how questions help your students connect God's world and God's Word. For example, I think questions give students opportunities to think about those connections. As students consider questions like, how should Christians bridge cultural differences, they learn to connect God's world and God's Word. Third, you can apply the characteristics of good questions to questions you ask. You can do this to sort of assess the questions you ask to make sure you're asking good questions. One characteristic of a good question is that it's open-ended, that it has more than one correct answer. So think about the questions you ask. What percentage of them are open-ended? What percentage of them do you want to be open-ended? Fourth, document questions. Document the questions you want to ask your students to help them connect God's world and God's Word. I find that documenting my questions helps me focus on them, helps me remember them. You know, document questions like, what's your responsibility? Or what's the solution? Or what's wrong with the world? And fifth, get your students to respond sincerely to your questions. Get your students to respond sincerely to your questions. One way you can work towards this is by making your classroom environment safe. Make it safe to respond sincerely to your questions. You know, maybe you can have your students talk about what it's like to be in a sincere discussion and an insincere discussion. You know, you can challenge your students to contribute to a sincere discussion. So use questions. Use questions to help your students connect God's world and God's Word. 5 ways you can move forward on this are analyzing why God asks questions, analyzing how questions help, applying the characteristics of good questions to the questions you ask, documenting the questions you want to ask your students, and getting your students to respond sincerely.